The xParticles emitter object is the engine behind xParticles. With the emitter, you can set how many particles are in your scene, how they are emitted, speed, and many more options. Let's have a look at it. The emitter will default to a rectangle and 1,000 particles per second. If we push play, you can see this happen. In your emitter object tab, you have the emitter shape. With the emitter shape, you can set it from rectangle to circle, from circle to ellipse. With the ellipse, you have orange handles to define the shape of your ellipse. Sphere, which will give you a spherical emission, which play. Object, which will let you define any object as a source. For example, if I get a platonic object, drop that in my object list and change the emit from to either polygon center or polygon area, then your particles will emit from the object. You also have a selection link, so you can set a set selection tag. So let's make the platonic editable. Go to polygon mode, select a couple of the faces, choose select set selection. Now we can go back to the emitter and drop our new selection tag into the selection slot, and then particles were emitted only from those two faces. This also works with vertex maps. Going down, you also have an option for textures. Let's have a look at how that works. With it selected, it's asking for a texture tag. So let's make a quick material. Get a new shader, material. In the color channel, I'm going to disable reflectance and add a noise. I'm going to change the noise to something like electric. Put more contrast into it. I'm just going to enable a bit more global scale and some speed so that that's animated. Going up, I'm going to go to the texture slot and choose colorizer, and that discolors the black and white grayscale noise, and then we can choose a gradient. Load preset, and let's choose full colors. So you can see it's creating a rainbow colored noise map. Drop this on the platonic object and you can see it in the viewport. What we want to do is our particles to be emitted using these colors. So with the emitter selected, drop the color texture into the texture tag slot, and then we have options for how it's going to work. We're going to emit channel color, which means it's going to emit from the color channel of the material that we just created, and you can choose any of the standard channels. The color for our particles is also going to come from the color because that's where our color information is stored. Speed will change the speed based on a grayscale gradient, and scale also from a grayscale map. Let's quickly change our display from dots to squares, and if we push play, you'll see our particles are now getting the color information from the map. It's also still talking to the selection tag, so let's turn that off. We can scale this down and push play, and now you can see we're getting full color spectrum based on our material. Let's delete this, go back, set this back to circle, and it will default back to the original green. Set initial state will record a position in time that you want your particles to start in. For example, if I push play and I want my particles to start at frame 0 in this position, set initial state will record the state. So now when we go back and push play, that's where the particles will start. So you can record anything at the beginning and have an initial state for your particle flow. Let's clear the state and default back to frame 0. The emissions tab gives you all the control you need over how many particles you have in your scene, their speed, radius, scale, and other things like motion inheritance or converting them to thinking particles, and what they do at their death. So let's have a quick look at some of these options. Maximum particles is the maximum amount of particles in your one scene. So it defaults to 2 million, and that can go up to 1 billion. Just simply add in more zeros. And that means you can have as many particles up to 1 billion as you need within your scene. Count from object is just going to get the particles from an object's points, polygons, or edges. Emission mode rate is the default mode. That means it's a particle count over time. So we've got the default of 1000 particles per second. You can change this to other options such as pulse, shot, trigger, or controlled only. Will mean that the system is set into a mode where you won't get any particles unless they are controlled. Shot gives you one shot of particles at your own count. So that can be anything. Let's go back to rate. Birth rate timing per second or per frame will give you the count birth rate based on either option. So per frame will be 1000 particles per frame. Per second will be 1000 particles per second. And variations for these options. The emit on all frames tech, when enabled, will emit for the whole scene. When disabled, will give you an option to set and end when your particles start and stop. So from default is going to stop at 3 seconds. Again, lifespan lets you define exactly how long your particles live for. If you want them to last for 3 seconds and have a variation on how long they last, you can enable that. And now your particle system will emit particles and they will last only 3 seconds long with the variation. Particle data gives you the speed or radius and scale variance for the particles. Motion inheritance is based on what the emitter is doing. If it's enabled and our emitter is going to have some rotation, for example, let's add in a vibrate tag. Motion inheritance enabled, it's going to get that vibration and convert that into the positions of particles. Disabled is simply rotating the flow. Enabled, it's converting it into the particles. Let's disable this. Thinking particles, when enabled, will make the emitter emit thinking particles. These can then be used with the thinking particles system inside Cinema 4D. And particle death gives you an action at their death. Extended data is going to have options for the rotation and physical properties, which is used within the domain object. Rewind data is used with the rewind modifier. Groups lets you define how many groups are emitted within one emitter. So you can then have as many as you want. Holding down Control will keep this window open, so you can add as many as you need. Each group can then be recolored. And you can also change the display . And when emitted, each particle will go into its own group. So you can see we have a group for each one, and that means you can have full control over each one, giving it its own modifiers and control systems. Let's go back to the default. Display gives you full control over the display of the particle information, and the emitter change in color. At the default, the emitter is green, but we have options for changing the color of the emitter. So within your scene, if you need to simply define emitters based on their color, it's easy to set that up. Show particles, when on and off, will change the display of the particles. Constraints display will show the constraints. Fast mode is a quick mode for particle display. Draw emitter will show the emitter shape. LOD is level of detail within the particle system, so less particle will show up in your scene. We have different editor displays, from squares to arrows or simple planes. Each one has their own options and color settings. Let's go back to squares. Color mode is different modes for how you color the particles over age or speed, etc. Random will give you a random color of your particles. Gradient random particles based on this gradient. Gradient parameter will be based on settings such as age, speed, mass, density, temperature, etc. And HUD display will show how many particles are in your scene, or only if selected. You can change how the display sets as well. The questions tab is where you add your questions, so that the emitter will always have these. You have options for if it's going to test once or test on all frames. Modifiers is where you include or exclude modifiers and MoGraph, effectors and Cinema 4D deformers. The editing tab lets you edit particles as if they were points. When enabled, if you go into points mode, it converts the particles into points, where you have the ability to select them. You can move them or delete them, and this information is stored. As you can see, the deleted particles are now gone from the system. There's other options such as path mode, points, blendings, and the spline for time. The advanced is going to let you enable threading and give you seeds if you need different emitters to have different seeds.